Okay, so without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Richard Loftus, who specializes in virology and infectious diseases and is a practicing internist here in the Valley. So, Dr. Loftus, thank you very much. Uh, we'll be hearing your highlights for about 25 minutes, and then we will do a Q&A. If you have a question, you might put it in the chat so you don't forget it. But other than that, we're going to have a good 25 minutes for Q&A. So, Dr. Loftus, take it away. All we can think about now that the inauguration is gone is about vaccines.
Yes. So, and yes, glad to. What a great day to get together. And yes, like so many, I'm very pleased to see an administration stepping in that actually supports science, because it's been a struggle not having that. Many of you may know that there was a pandemic preparedness team that was dismissed by the Trump administration about 18 months before this pandemic hit. And Joe Biden himself on Twitter said in October of 2019, we are now highly vulnerable to a pandemic. And then the next month, we learned that there was something going on in China, and here we are. So my background, I trained at UCSF. I did med school, residency, and I was the HIV fellow at San Francisco General. So I did everything at UCSF. Then I worked in San Francisco for about 5 years, and then 10 years ago got recruited to come down to Eisenhower to help with the launch of their primary care foundation medical practice and also help start the internal medicine residency. I was the founding associate program director of that internal medicine residency, which is now in its 8th year of residence. While I've been here in the Valley, one of the things that I wound up doing was launching a research office that incubated inside of Eisenhower initially and then went independent. Most of my work in that group has been developing new drugs for HIV, since we have a lot of patients who live in the Valley who need new medicines because of drug resistance. And then of late, I've done some projects related to COVID, including a COVID vaccine study that has not yet started. I was supposed to start actually this month, but it's a Merck vaccine. And so that's been pushed back to a June launch. A lot of the companies that were not first out of the gate with COVID vaccines have kind of had to scramble now that there are some on the market. Some of you even yesterday may have seen that one of the vaccines in development, Novavax, had older adults who were participating in the study drop out of being in the study so they could go and get their Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, which are now under an emergency usage authorization from FDA. That's going to make it harder to do studies. And I think Merck, which is the company whose product I'm helping to develop, decided with at least 2 vaccines approved and a couple more coming, how they studied their vaccine was going to have to change, because the initial studies compared the vaccine to nothing, a placebo, in other words. And we looked at how did people do who got vaccinated versus people who had nothing. But now that there are vaccines available, we'll probably need to do studies that compare the new vaccine against the older vaccines that are available. The field that I work in of HIV kind of was considered to be a field whose practices turned over about every 6 months because of furious research on how to treat HIV and improve people's health living with the virus. But COVID is about 100 times faster. So even as somebody who is used to the clinical practice of the field I work in turning over within half a year, this has been lightning fast, and there's still so much that we don't know. But just to go over the broad concepts, the virus that causes COVID is SARS-CoV-2. It's a member of a group of viruses, coronaviruses, of which there are probably at least 4 that are commonly found in people and mostly cause head colds. In fact, 2 of the 3 most common causes of winter colds, like drippy nose and cough, are coronaviruses, but they are benign coronaviruses that have been around us for at least hundreds of years, we think. And so we put up with them, and aside from sniffles, they're not too dreadful. Unfortunately, SARS-CoV-2 is a beta coronavirus that is different enough that we have not evolved to deal with it. And it has some unusual properties also that make it particularly problematic. I think most people are familiar with COVID. It starts off as a respiratory infection. It feels initially oftentimes like a mild cold, but the difference is it lasts longer. Clinically, most people are sick for at least 3 weeks. Um, a rare, lucky few wind up with minimal to no symptoms that they notice. Um, Most people eventually will notice symptoms of some severity, and many people get critically sick. 1% of adults, in their 50s who get this can wind up dead from it, and the percentage of people that face a mortal risk from SARS-CoV-2 infection goes up with older age groups. And so, I think we've all been familiar with, what has unfolded across the United States, particularly here in Southern California, particularly in Los Angeles, where they've counted 1 million cases, and they've had a dreadful effect on their hospitals because everybody's getting it at once. Here in the Coachella Valley, I admitted the lady that turned out to be our first COVID diagnosis in Riverside County, who came to my service initially being diagnosed with what turned out to be a leukemia. She went off to a skilled nursing center and came back to us with fever and a cough. And she actually came back to the night service. So I was at home, and the night doctor wound up getting a call from a radiologist in Italy who said, are you the doctor taking care of this patient? And he said, yes. She came back to us from a nursing home where we'd sent her a week and a half ago. And he said, well, I hate to tell you, but, this looks like COVID to me. What are her symptoms? And she'd had, fever and what looked like a pneumonia from her symptoms. And it turned out it was COVID. And she unfortunately wound up being one of the first 2 deaths in the county as well. So what's been interesting about SARS-CoV-2, this virus that causes COVID, is we've been able to develop vaccines rather quickly. Part of that is because the first couple of vaccines that got approved, Pfizer and Moderna, are what are called RNA vaccines. And what this means is they are basically, the vaccine is comprised of tiny little particles made of lipids, made of fats, that are designed to merge with human cells. And inside those particles are RNA sequences, which your cell uses to make protein. And the result is that when the vaccine particle gets into a cell, the cell receives the RNA, and the RNA makes the cell make protein. In this case, what the cell makes are the spike protein, which is the surface protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And by having the cell make those proteins and present those proteins on its surface, it alerts the immune system. It's a little bit like a wanted poster from the Old West. It's like, immune cells, if you see anything that looks like this, it's the enemy, kill it. And so that is how vaccines work, is they teach the immune system what to watch out for, what's dangerous, and what the immune system should attack. So these vaccines are unusual because they are the first ones coming into widespread use in human patients of this type of vaccine. And they are notable for their strong immune reactions that they provoke, which is an advantage in a vaccine, and also because they can be developed very quickly. Kismekia Corral, who's one of the scientists who developed the Moderna vaccine, is a pen pal of mine. And Kizzy had her vaccine available, like it went into studies, I think, in April. So at NIH. So these vaccines are able to be produced rather quickly, which is an advantage. The 2 vaccines that are on the market right now, these RNA vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna, are the ones so far that have gotten emergency authorization from the FDA. There are a few other candidates that are pretty close behind that will probably also get approved in the next 6 weeks to 2 months. One is from Johnson & Johnson. Another one, which may take a little bit longer, is from AstraZeneca. That's the Oxford vaccine. And then there's a lot of excitement also about a vaccine called Novavax from Novartis, which is yet another type of vaccine. So so far, the only 2 RNA vaccines are Pfizer and Moderna. But I think, within pretty short order here, we're probably going to have at least 3 other kinds of vaccines up for consideration by FDA for emergency authorization, which is good because that should help our vaccine supply problem. But right now, the 2 that we have are these RNA vaccines. And I'll talk in a little bit about some other potential advantages to that particular type of vaccine compared to some of the older models. Now, some people would say, well, wouldn't you want one of the older kinds because we know how those work better? And one thing I like to tell people is, although these 2 RNA vaccines for COVID are the first 2 that have come into widespread human use, we've actually had RNA vaccines in trials for other viruses that are not nearly as dastardly or catastrophic for the planet as the COVID virus is. And so they haven't arrived for market approval at FDA yet. But we've got data on RNA vaccines going back 5 years. For example, there's a virus called CMV that probably most of you have never heard of unless you have medical training. It's a virus that occasionally will infect an adult and cause fevers and swollen lymph nodes, but generally speaking is transmitted in younger people. It's transmitted in saliva, it's transmitted in feces. It's sometimes a source for fever in older adults if they're changing the diapers of a baby who has CMV. But CMV usually is only disease causing in people with severe immune problems like AIDS. And there's a CMV vaccine that's been developed using the RNA vaccine technology. And that has been in human subjects now for 5 years. So the point just being that although people say, oh, these vaccines are new and we don't know that much about their safety, in fact, although I can't say that we've had 70,000 patients who've received those RNA vaccines, we've certainly had probably in the neighborhood of about 2,000 patients who've had some of these other kinds of RNA vaccines. And they're not on the market yet just because FDA takes its time. Those studies are small. The viruses are not as urgent medical emergencies. And so there wasn't sort of the urgency to get them approved in a hurry. But they've been around for at least half a decade. So when people say, oh, we don't really have a lot of information on the safety of these vaccines, I say, well, so that's to some extent, there's some truth to that because they're new. But, we have data going back 5 years and at least a couple of thousand subjects who've had RNA vaccines of other types, and they've been fine. In fact, the safety of these RNA vaccines looks very good. Serious allergic reactions, although I think people heard a lot of media about, possible allergic reactions to the Pfizer vaccine when it got approved in the United Kingdom. And there was some attention in the media to a couple of patients who got allergic reactions. In fact, what we find is that severe allergic reactions, something that we call anaphylaxis, which can actually close up your airway, make you stop breathing, really severe allergy reactions that are life-threatening, are something on the order of like 11 out of a million people will have those, and they're very treatable. And 70% of those reactions happen within 15 minutes. So when people get their RNA vaccination, they will be asked to wait for 15 minutes for a nurse to watch them, because the vast majority of people that might have one of the rare allergic reactions are going to have it in those first 15 minutes. The United Kingdom has advised that if anybody has a history of that kind of allergic reaction to foods or medicines, that they hold off on getting those types of vaccines. In America, unless you're known to be specifically allergic to something in the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, like I think polysorbate 80, which is a preservative that some people rarely are allergic to, there's no official advisory not to get the vaccines. I think the point of view from most medical authorities is the safety of these vaccines is excellent. And in the meantime, the danger of the virus is terrible. In fact, I have to say, as somebody with virology training, I was concerned all the way back in like April and May when we started hearing about complications of COVID, that it wasn't just that it caused a terrible viral pneumonia that made people stop breathing in some cases when it was severe enough. We have something called long COVID, where the virus can actually get into your blood vessels, get into your organs, and cause things like brain damage or heart damage or kidney damage. Damage to the pancreas, which is one of your digestive organs. There's a lot of people who wind up with chronic fatigue, chronic muscle pain, chronic chest pain, even 6 months out from surviving COVID. And in fact, Mount Sinai in New York has a whole clinic on people who've developed what we call long COVID, complications lingering for months after their initial COVID infection. And a lot of the patients in that clinic are 20, 30, 40-year-olds who were in good health. And they weren't people who like wound up on ventilators from COVID. These were not people who were critically sick with COVID and even went into the hospital, or much less go to the ICU. Some of these people had mild COVID that didn't seem that bad. Maybe it was like a flu and they nursed it at home, but then it just never, ever went away. So to me, even more compelling than the risk of death, which, most people are not going to die from their COVID if they get it, or the concern that everybody will get COVID at once. And remember, 1 in 7 people with COVID needs a hospital. So if you have 1 million people who all get it at the same time, even if you're talking about, that's hundreds of thousands of people that will all need a hospital at the same time. Well, we only have roughly 1,200 hospital beds in the entire Coachella Valley. And the population here is 400,000 people. So even if only 1% of the valley all had hospital level COVID at the same time, we don't have enough beds for them. And in fact, at Eisenhower, they've been adding beds and converting hospital wards. I mean, they expected this month that 2/3 of all the hospital beds at Eisenhower will be COVID cases. 2/3 of the hospital, which means, of course, all the other kinds of care has to be smushed in to what would normally be a full hospital worth of beds, but now we don't have them. So to me, what I was most worried about in January to my family, and what I sent out emails to my family and friends with sort of my advisories about what's going on with the COVID pandemic. And I told them the most dangerous thing for a lot of us in January, February, is we'll get appendicitis or have some hospital level event that needs a surgery, and there won't be a bed for us because the hospitals are overwhelmed with COVID. Which is why it's been so important for people to do what they can to prevent getting COVID in the first place, because our hospitals just can't handle it. But aside from the risk of death or the risk of our hospitals getting overwhelmed if everyone gets sick at once, my big concern is, what do we do with all these people after COVID? It looks like maybe as many as 10% of COVID survivors will have lingering symptoms. In China, I think, 3 months out, like 75% of patients still had some symptoms recovering. That's a heck of a lot of people at 3 months after, an infection to still have noticeable symptoms. And the United Kingdom, I think, is furthest ahead in terms of looking at how many people have lingering long COVID symptoms, how many there are, and what the nature of them are. And New York now has a clinic, and there are a few started in other places. University of Washington, Seattle has set up a long COVID clinic. The NIH in DC is setting one up. And so, I guess Bethesda, but so we're starting to get our heads wrapped around that. But to me, one thing I'll be eager to see is that with vaccination, as we're able to prevent the spread of the natural virus, we'll see a lot more people infected, which is important, not just because it means less deaths or less hospitalizations, but it also will mean less people at risk of getting permanent side effects of the virus. So in terms of signing up for vaccination, California now has reached the point where adults over 65 are eligible. But now, of course, we've reached the point where, signing up is a little confusing, and there's clearly tons more demand for vaccine than we have vaccine doses. At this point, I think California has delivered, 1.5 million vaccine doses. And, it's being handled county by county. I would say that, the state is trying to get this more organized. I really fault the federal government and the Trump administration for why this has seemed so chaotic. And, I have no difficulty being blunt about that. I was an AIDS activist with a civil disobedience arrest record. So I'm going to tell it like it is. And I'm not sorry about that. The Trump administration was incompetent. While Operation Warp Speed did a really good job of creating some, fortunately, very elegant and very effective vaccines to prevent the illness of COVID if people get infected. Well, I think Michael Osterhoff from Minnesota, who's now on Biden's advisory council, put it best. Operation Warp Speed it was like trying to build a bridge over a 2-mile gorge. And they got the bridge really well built all the way until the last 100 feet, and then they didn't build the last 100 feet. By not funding the states to have resources to distribute and administer the vaccine, they kind of like made this beautiful product, and then there's actually no resources to actually get it into arms. And as you know, those of us in virology say, vaccines don't save lives, vaccinations save lives. If those vaccines don't get into people's bodies, it doesn't help the situation. And so really no resources or assistance in logistical planning went into the delivery, distribution, and administration of the vaccines. And that was just incompetent. But, you know, I don't expect fascists to be competent anyway. But it was incompetent. And so that's part of why it's chaotic. It's part of why different states have different rules about who can get it. For example, in New Mexico, the first people that are getting vaccinated are the vaccinators themselves, who are healthcare workers, which makes sense because they don't want them to get sick and get in the way of delivering vaccine to other people. You know, in some places, they've abided by the idea of getting vaccine preferentially to those that are most socially vulnerable, but not all states have agreed to do that. You know, most states are abiding by the idea that older adults should get vaccines sooner because they're the most at risk of death or serious hospitalization and illness from COVID, and that does make sense. So initially, our Tier 1A included people over 75, and then now we're allowing people 65 and above to sign up for vaccination. The state, to their credit, has created a sort of alert system that you can sign up for to find out when you can sign up for your vaccine. And you can get to that at covid19.ca.gov. So it's like it sounds, COVID number 1, number 9, covid19.ca.gov. And that's where the state has put its dashboard on how we're doing administering doses, how many doses they've shipped. I think there have been 4 million doses ordered. 3.7 million doses have been shipped off to facilities that are giving vaccinations. And like I mentioned, 1.5 million doses have already been administered. Almost all of those are the first dose, and all of those people need a second dose. The second dose is, I think it's 4 weeks out for Moderna and 3 weeks out for Pfizer. And so, you know, there's some logistics around a second dose. You know, here in Riverside County, I went and got my first dose at the fairgrounds in Indio. And, you know, they did tell me that I would be eligible to sign up for a second dose, but they didn't assign a second dose appointment to me. It's kind of on me to sign up. And if any of you have already looked on the county website for signing up, you basically have to just wait until they open up dates, and then you have to pounce and sign yourself up for it. We're hoping that more primary care offices will be offering vaccinations. I know Eisenhower, for example, is going to, now that they've done their personnel, they are going to have vaccinators administering vaccines to patients. They've been beta testing their process with a sort of subset of vulnerable patients to make sure their workflow is smooth, because they expect to have thousands of people and they want to make sure that their system works okay. But it's from what I've been hearing, it's going pretty well. Our free clinic was alerted that we would be asked to also assist with vaccinating patients in the Indio area. And so, you know, they asked me if I'd be willing to show up and be a vaccinator. And I said, of course, let me know when you need me. So as more facilities are able to receive vaccine supplies from the state and serve as vaccination sites, it should get easier because there will be more places for you to sign up to go get vaccinated. A number of pharmacies initially from the state of California were designated as going out to skilled nursing centers to give vaccine to older adults who live in nursing homes, CVS and Walgreens. And now Ralph's Pharmacy in the Coachella Valley is also going to be a vaccine distribution site, although they tell you, you still have to sign up through the county. You cannot sign up through the pharmacy. They're not doing it that way. I definitely know that a lot of the people that have talked to me about their experience trying to get vaccination set up for themselves or for their older parents have found it to be kind of chaotic. I'm hoping that with better federal leadership, the states will have a bit of a whip cracked over them. The state of California, I think, has done a pretty good job. I know personally the people at Riverside County Public Health, and I think they are doing a hero's job given they were given no resources to pull this off. And they've also had to increase the size of their staff ninefold just to do contact tracing for COVID this year. So they've already been stretched beyond the limits. And that's part of why I fault the federal administration that left us for the problems, because it should have been obvious to them that there weren't resources in small public health departments, which have been poorly funded for 2 generations in this country. And we're already stretched to the gills taking care of the emergency of COVID, asking them to also then spare some bandwidth to figure out and staff vaccination was ridiculous, because anybody who knows anything about what's going on in public health on the ground knows that they're really beyond their capacity as it is. And there should have been ways to enlist additional resources, which is exactly what Joe Biden and his advisory council have been talking about for the last 3 months, thank God. So I think things are going to get better soon, because I think we'll have better federal leadership and more resources going to the states to help them as they struggle to get vaccine into people. So I think that's the broad strokes I wanted to cover, and I think that covers the 25 minutes or so. So I'm ready now to sort of field any questions. I don't know if one of the facilitators wants to read questions off the chat, and I can certainly field questions from people on the Zoom as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Loftus. This is Lorraine Carlson speaking. I have made notes of the questions that came onto the chat, so you don't have to, I'll just go through each one. There's about 6 questions altogether. There are also some very nice comments from among people who have already had their first dosage. So and so far the vaccinations, the reactions have been mild, to say the least. So that's good. Okay, so here's the first question: should people who have had COVID-19 get vaccinated?
Hi, Lorraine. You froze for me, so I couldn't hear you.
Oh, well, that's great. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're fine
Okay.
now.
Okay, so the question is, should people who have had COVID-19 get vaccinated?
That's a great question. So we think the answer is yes. And, the advice that I've heard from experts on this topic is they've been advising people to wait anywhere from 30 to 90 days. Why are they suggesting they wait? Because we believe that they will have natural immunity for at least that long. And so they won't really require a vaccine any sooner than that, because their body should have immunity that will protect them at least that long. There's a great immunologist in our backyard in San Diego or La Jolla, actually, Shane Crotty, who's one of my gurus of immunology for COVID. And his group looked at the immune responses of people who fought off COVID. And his impression is that, most people, it looks from his data like roughly 12-ish% of people lose their immunity as soon as about 3 months out. But he thinks that most people will have immunity from true infection for many months, if not years. But it is also looking true that the immunity you produce naturally to the virus isn't probably as strong or perhaps as broad as what you can get from a well-designed vaccine. And there's reasons why that's true, but the whole point of the vaccine is to give your body the best training it could have to deal with. It's sort of like the difference between on-the-job learning versus taking a class and then doing something. The vaccine is like a class for your immune cells, so it really gives them a rigorous grounding in what to expect and what to do. Whereas learning from the actual virus may work for some people, but may not work that well for others, which is why some people's immunity wanes. So I do think that if you fought off natural COVID, you should still get vaccinated, because you may wind up with better and stronger immunity than what you were able to produce under your own power. And we're suggesting to wait at least 30 days to maybe 90 days before you go get vaccinated. I've not seen any specific instructions for the state of California as far as that goes, but I have heard several California health experts advise that yes, people who've survived COVID should get the vaccine and are eligible to get the vaccine. It's not a reason not to get vaccinated.
Great. Okay. I just lost my text. Hold on a second. All right. The next question is, hang on a sec. Just had it on my notes and it just disappeared. Got it. Okay. What do you think about the vaccination allotment in Riverside County? And what are the prospects for future availability and distribution? In other words, what is the best advice for getting one if you're under 65? No conditions qualifying that qualifies you for the early groups.
Yeah. So if you're not in a higher risk group, you'll fall sort of into probably below tier 1C, but you'll still get it. When I'm guessing probably later spring, April-ish. I have heard from some folks who signed up this week who got appointments in March. And they're able to sign up because they're in high risk groups. But I do think that as we have more sites offering vaccination, there will be many more locations you can get vaccinated at. And that's going to help, I think, speed up how easy it is to sign up. People who are signing up now have to be online for like 4 hours or be on the phone for 4 hours to talk to somebody to get their appointment. And then they're getting appointments 2 months from now. By later spring, you're going to see that your response times are going to be faster to get an appointment, and your wait time to get to that appointment will be much shorter because we're going to have tons more places to give vaccine. So that should help. I've heard Tony Fauci, speak optimistically about, most people should be able to get vaccinated by the end of the spring. I think that's pretty ambitious. The Biden administration has said they want to do 100 million doses in 100 days, which means 1 million doses a day. That's ambitious, but it's doable, especially if we actually put any kind of meaningful willpower and resources of the federal government into it. I'll give you an example. The Trump administration never invoked the Defense Production Act to make protective gear for healthcare workers, other frontline workers like restaurant folks who need to be protected, or for vaccines. The Biden administration has already committed to invoke the Defense Production Act so that all the ingredients that go into the vaccines are given official overrides from the federal government to just pump out as much raw material for vaccines as possible, so that Pfizer and Moderna, among other manufacturers, have all the materials they need to pump out as much vaccine as we need. So that will help. And that's the difference between having the will of the federal government focused on a problem versus just being a shrug and you're on your own, which is what we've mostly been dealing with up till now.
Okay, so here's another question. So both vaccines require a second shot. The Pfizer biotech is about 21 days after the first shot, and Moderna is 28 after the first shot. Do you have to repeat the first shot if you miss the date for your second shot?
No, that's a good question, and no. And the question is, I think, bigger, kind of the question behind the question is, why do we even need a second dose? Because we do get measurable immune responses from a single dose. And in fact, in the Pfizer and Moderna studies, between 10 and 14 days after the first shot, you can start to tell the difference in the two groups, because the vaccinated people, even though they've only had one dose, by that point are starting to get less COVID cases than the folks who don't have any vaccination. So we can tell there's already useful immunity produced by the first dose. So why do you even need a second dose? Because it's the difference between having had a class a year ago and now you're expected to remember what was in it and use what you were taught, versus having a refresher course right before you have to go take the test. So, the second dose strengthens the level of antibodies probably 8 to 12 fold. And that probably also will mean that the immunity that's protective lasts for years as opposed to maybe months. And so that's why a second dose is a good idea. How do we know when to give the second dose? Well, the vaccinologists kind of guess. And these are compared to, like, if you've ever done like hepatitis vaccination for travel, hepatitis A we space out by 6 months. Although if you're in a hurry, you can actually space them closer if you must. But generally speaking, second doses are given some significant time down the road. We don't normally space them as close as 3 to 4 weeks. Why are they so close together for the COVID vaccines? Because we've been in a hurry to make them and show that they work. So if you keep the second dose soon after the first one, you've had your 2 doses in a hurry, and then you can see how well that protects. And it looks like, I think some people maybe were concerned that it was a little too soon to do the second dose. But like I said, time's a wasting when you've got a virus that's threatening the world. So that's why the second dose for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines comes pretty soon after the first dose. And you may have remembered, some of you, that the media was talking about how vaccinologists and epidemiologists and virologists were arm wrestling over whether you could even just wing it with just one dose. And maybe we should just go with one, and that way we'll have twice as many people able to get vaccinated. But, I tended to favor with the more conservative group. How we know how well these things protect is by using them properly. And the proper use that we tested is 2 doses spaced 3 to 4 weeks apart, depending on which vaccine we're talking about. So I don't support us winging it with 1 dose. The big worry with that is that you'll wind up with people with sort of half-assed immunity with kind of low antibody levels. And the problem with that is that may be just enough antiviral activity to teach the virus how to get around immunity. We have that problem with drugs, HIV drugs. If we don't dose them strongly enough, the virus will study the medicines, get around them and mutate around them, and then they don't work anymore forever. And we're already starting to have a problem with variants of COVID that have unique genetic mutations that look like they could get around immunity. The one from South Africa had some test tube data this week that makes us a little worried that the new virus that's mutated away can actually get around immunity that's produced by vaccines or by the monoclonal antibody therapies that we use. We don't know yet for sure that's true because this is test tube work, but we're kind of concerned that some of these mutants might be able to get around existing immunity or vaccines, which means we'd sort of be starting with like a second pandemic of the new virus, which would be terrible. So that's why there's a big hurry to get vaccination done so we can stop this virus spreading, so we can stop this virus from mutating into more dastardly forms.
Okay,
I hope
great.
that answers the question.
Yes, it did. Okay, so I have a couple
And
more.
and just a kind of side comment, there are some vaccines designed to be single doses. The Merck one I'm working on is a single dose, and Johnson & Johnson did studies looking at 1 dose and 2 doses. And I'm not sure, I thought they were going to do a 2-dose proposal to the FDA, but I'm hearing that they will ask for a 1-dose approval. So we may have a 1-dose vaccine available soon, even within a couple of months. And that will certainly simplify getting a lot of people vaccinated in a hurry.
So along those lines, what's the status of the AstraZeneca vaccine for release in the US? And is that a 1 or 2 dose?
Yeah, the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was developed in part with collaboration with Oxford, was told by the FDA to kind of go back to their quarter and keep working. So we expect that it'll be up for consideration probably in a couple of months. Of all the ones that are almost ready for approval, of the 3, that's the one that I think will go last, because they already kind of did a flyby with FDA and they sort of said, we need more data. There's a real problem with the AstraZeneca development. Unlike Pfizer and Moderna, which did these really big, beautiful, well-designed studies that clearly told us what the vaccines do and don't do, Oxford had 4 different studies of different levels of patients in lots of different countries. And they were the one that some of you may have heard about, where they, on accident, wound up with a weird dose where they gave half a dose the first time and then gave the full dose the second time. And it wasn't because they did it on purpose. It was because people were confused about their protocol and they dosed it wrong. But what was weird was the vaccine looked 65% effective in people who got the dose they planned to give. And then weirdly, the people who got a half dose the first time and a full dose the second time had 90% effectiveness, which nobody could understand. And then the Oxford, AstraZeneca people were saying, well, let's just combine the data from 4 different studies, which most of us who do clinical research are like, no. That they weren't designed to be mishmashed together like that. It's mixing ingredients from completely different recipes. That's not the right way to look at this. So there's a little bit of a question mark over the AstraZeneca vaccine about exactly how well it works. Is it on par with, Pfizer, Moderna? Well, if we believe the 90% figure, then it sounds like it is in the same neighborhood. But then we have other studies that say maybe 60%. So I don't think we really know how strong it is, but it's likely to be, good enough that we should use it. You know, if it turns out in the long run, after close scrutiny and careful, rigorous analysis, that it's not quite as fully protective as like as Pfizer and Moderna, it's not like you can't go get revaccinated later with a different product if we find out they're superior. Right now, we just need to give enough protective immunity to enough people to stop this bloody virus from spreading. That's really the critical thing. And, you know, I would say even if it's only 60, 65% effective, that's still really good. And that's probably good enough for what we need to do as a society. We can sort of pretty up the details with people getting, you know, subsequent vaccinations with maybe stronger products later if it turns out we think that's useful to do. So I would tell people, you know, I had one friend, you know, my family priest actually emailed me and said, should I ask for Pfizer or Moderna? Like, I heard Pfizer's a little stronger. And I'm like, you know, Father, it's not going to matter which one because they're only going to offer you one. Like, you'll get the vaccine that they have that day when you go. So it doesn't, you don't really need to have an opinion on this because whatever they're giving, you should say yes. So it may be that eventually we'll have multiple vaccines and it's just whatever they're serving that day is what you get. And I would just say, like, just say yes, because, you know, they're all looking very safe and they're all looking reasonably enough protective. They're way better than what I hope to have for a virus that literally got sequenced 12 months ago. So I think we're doing very well with all the vaccine products. And in fact, one of the later ones that's going to come out, hopefully in the next couple of months, Novavax, may even be better than Pfizer and Moderna, even though it's an older technology, because of the way they designed it. And I won't go into the nerdy details, but I would just say, you know, take whichever one they're giving. They're all probably reasonably good. But I would say, just from a clinical trials person's perspective, they seemed a little sloppy in how they did their trials on their product. And that doesn't help their case in terms of getting approval. So I can see why our FDA said, go back to your corner and keep working. We'll talk to you in a couple of months, because I think they needed to kind of get more data before they could make their case before the FDA. I think they're going to get an approval, but we want to be able to actually say with some clarity what their vaccine can do before we introduce it to the population. And I think a lot of us feel like we don't know all the details we need to know yet with enough clarity to feel like it's time to say yes to them. But they're going to get an approval pretty soon.
A quick follow-up to that one would be, okay, so we have Pfizer, we have Moderna. It looks like is Johnson & Johnson, J&J coming down the pike? Well, if you had to give the top five that you know, knowing that it's going to be a rollout, it's going to take time, what do you think are going to be the top 4 or 5 vaccines that are going to be available here in the US?
Well, the next one's coming out. Johnson & Johnson will almost certainly be the next one that's reviewed. And then I think probably Novavax. And then I think probably AstraZeneca. The Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca products are DNA vaccines. And that's an older technology that has been used in other vaccines, including experimental vaccines for HIV. So we have some experience with that kind of vaccine. Novavax is called a protein subunit vaccine. It's very similar to the vaccines we have for hepatitis B, and they work really well. And in fact, it has this fancy adjuvant that everybody is oohing and ahhing over like it's a fancy sports car. But the adjuvant is new, and everybody's very excited because it sort of supercharges the vaccine and makes it that much more effective. And that's why people are saying that even though Novavax is an old-fashioned protein vaccine, it may actually produce immunity that's even better than what we get with Pfizer and Moderna. The difference is, and it's probably easier to manufacture and it's not as fussy about the storage as the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. But I would say the advantage to the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines is being RNA vaccines. If we wind up with mutant viruses that get around normal immunity or the older generation of COVID vaccines, we will be able to produce COVID vaccine 2.0 in 6 weeks. With the RNA vaccine technology. So if it does turn out that these mutations are able to get around the existing treatments and immune responses that our current vaccines can produce, we'll be able to put out a new version that captures the mutants really, really fast. It's similar. It'll be as simple as, you know, every year we have an influenza vaccine that's for that year's crop of influenza viruses, and every year we revise it. And you know, we don't make them do big, 40,000 person studies every year on the vaccines. We just say it's the same vaccine and you tweaked it a little bit for the new viruses. Thanks a lot. It's approved. Get vaccinating. So I have a feeling that if we run into that situation ultimately with these mutants, like the L452 mutant in California, if it turns out it gets around the first generation vaccines, we'll just make COVID vaccine 2.0 with Moderna and Pfizer, and that'll handle it.
Great. Okay, so there's about four or five other questions, and if I don't get your question, people, it's not because I haven't tried. I'm trying to pick ones that will help get to the gist of what we're trying to talk about for today. Okay, so one other question is, are the two vaccines used today showing the same type of side effects and severity, severity of side effects compared to each other?
Yes, they're about the same. True allergic reactions are rare. I had a little table that I put down and now I can't find it basically, if you've had the shingles vaccine, these are easier than the shingles vaccine. But it's the same kinds of side effects as, if you've ever had a tetanus vaccination, sore arm for a couple of days, low-grade fever for a couple of days, headache, fatigue, muscle aches, mild flu-like symptoms. Most of the people I know who've had their second dose, most people on their first dose, I had my first dose of Moderna, I had nothing except a barely noticeable sore arm where I got the shot. Most people, if they're going to get side effects, get it after their second dose. And most of the side effects last for like a day and a half, maybe 2 days. So most of the nurses I know that are getting their vaccination, when they get their second dose, they take the next day off so that most of the side effects they'd have from vaccination kind of run their course on their day off. If they have a weekend off, that's even better. I talked to a friend this morning who scheduled her second dose on a Friday, and she's off Saturday, Sunday. So she's just gonna chill through the weekend and take Tylenol. By the way, if you get side effects from your vaccination, Tylenol is your friend. Don't use ibuprofen because there's some concern that it will modulate your immune response and it may adversely affect your immunity. So if you need to use something for your fever or muscle aches, use Tylenol. Even if you have liver disease, if you dose it modestly, and you can ask your doctor how to do that, it won't hurt you. If you're eating your veggies, you can metabolize Tylenol just fine with no problem.
Great. Okay, so here's another question. Does having had the COVID-19 grant a person immunity to the new strains?
So that's what the South African researchers looked at, was we've got people who survived COVID. Do their immune responses, do their antibodies block these mutants? And the answer to the South African mutant virus was half of the patients did not have protective immunity. So that was kind of scary.
Yeah.
And that's why we're prepared. Now, the good news is, while we're watching 3 mutants, and now California has this 4th one of concern, we suspect that the California mutant is probably not able to get around standard immunity. The B117 mutant from Britain, not able to get around standard COVID immunity. So our monoclonal antibody therapy should work, our vaccine should work. Most of these mutants are more contagious, but they're not more likely to get around our vaccines. But the South African one is different enough that it looks like it can. And we're kind of on the fence right now about the Brazil-Japan one. So we're still studying that. It's only been in 3 different countries and we don't have a lot of experience with it yet. But right now people are studying this question to figure it out. And like I said, if it turns out that any of these variants look like they can get around the existing tools, we'll just make COVID vaccine 2.0 with the RNA vaccines, and that will take care of it. And so that's how we'll have to solve it if it comes to it. The big goal, of course, is get as many people vaccinated so this bloody virus stops spreading. Because, with millions and millions of people infected, it gives the virus lots of chances to mutate. So if we can stop it from spreading, it'll stop mutating. Unlike other dastardly viruses like HIV or flu, which mutate all the bloody time. That's why we have to have a new flu shot every year. The COVID virus, or SARS-CoV-2, actually does not mutate very fast. But if you let it replicate in millions of people, it gets lots of opportunities. So eventually it's going to come up with some, dastardly tools and tricks. So, but, we do have a potential solution, even in the worst case scenario. We don't know, by the way, that the South Africa findings, that's in a test tube, and that's really different because in the test tube, the human immune cells are not present and they're evolved to adjust to new situations. Who's to say that, somebody who already was vaccinated against the normal COVID virus couldn't have their immune cells notice that this mutant is a little different and create new immune responses, because that's what your body does anyway. And it could very well be that just by having a leg up thanks to vaccination, you don't wind up super sick, regardless of the fact that it's a mutant virus. But we don't know for sure. We just haven't had enough experience yet to know. But there is some concern about these mutants getting around the vaccines.
One last question from what was in the chats, and then we'll have maybe just a couple minutes to open up to if there are any other questions that you haven't been able to answer for us. Does having had COVID-19, wait, hold on, wrong. Right. Once a person contracts COVID, how much time does it take for them to no longer be contagious?
That's a good question. There have been a few different teams that have looked at this. There was a group in Germany that looked at this, and Taiwan's Center for Disease Control looked at this. It's tricky to answer that because you actually have to have a biohazard laboratory study that, because what you're looking for is contagious virus. And that requires fancy biohazard labs, because you have to culture live dangerous virus out of these patients, rather than just using like our PCR test. And one of the things we've learned is the PCR test, which initially was the only test we had for COVID, was positive in people months after their COVID. And we didn't really know what that meant. Eventually, we figured out that the levels were really, really low, and they weren't actually pumping out contagious virus. They just had sort of bits and pieces of virus, and the test can't distinguish between a virus that can, infect somebody and a bunch of broken parts. So the answer to that is that after about 10 days, in most cases, with a mild to moderate COVID, you no longer pump out infectious virus, and you're not at risk of infecting other people. Initially, we told people to isolate for 14 days, and then the CDC modified it to 10 days because we've really not seen any studies under normal conditions with mild to moderate COVID where anybody produces contagious particles after 10 days from the first day of their symptoms. For critically sick patients, if you were sick enough to be in the ICU, some of those patients will shed contagious virus as long as 21 days. So if you want to be super duper conservative, you could consider yourself contagious for 3 weeks, but that would only be with critically sick patients. We do have rare patients with blood disorders like leukemias or other kinds of blood cancers where it looks like they have ongoing replication for longer, and they may be contagious for longer, but they're unusual. For most people, after 10 days, you're not able to make any more contagious virus. Even if you're still coughing or having fatigue or whatever else, after the 10th day of symptoms, you're probably not pumping out contagious particles any longer, and you're not a threat of infecting anybody else.
Great. Okay, so before I open up to questions, I have one other question for you. It's my own personal question. What are your thoughts about if you have an autoimmune disease? I have rheumatoid arthritis, but I'm not on any disease-modifying DMARDs or the biologics. I've been able to keep it pretty much under wraps, under control through diet. So I'm not actively having big symptoms. What should I go ahead and get the vaccine? Should I worry about?
Yes, that's a good question. And that's what I can tell you is that people with rheumatologic disorders and autoimmune disorders were represented in the Pfizer and Moderna studies, as were patients with HIV. And while we haven't seen those different patient populations have their results separately presented, we know from the analysis that none of the patients with particular chronic conditions looked any different from anyone else in terms of their ability to respond to vaccination. They didn't seem to have any special problems or issues. Obviously, more data will be available the longer we go. You have the advantage of not being on any immune modulating treatments, so that makes your ability to respond to the vaccines excellent. Even in people who maybe have situations where they're on immune modifying drugs, I would still say the benefits of getting vaccinated certainly outweigh any negatives. This is not like a live attenuated vaccine like we have for some kinds of viruses, where you're getting an actual virus as the vaccine, where having anything immune suppressive would be dangerous because the vaccine could run all over you if your immune system is not strong. These vaccines use proteins or use RNA or DNA sequences. And so I expect these vaccines to be safe for people, even if they were on immune suppressing treatments. I would still say, although their ability to respond to the vaccines may not be as robust as people without treatment with such drugs, I'd still say the benefits are, possible, and the downsides are minimal, even if you were on something immune suppressive. Certainly for the RNA vaccines, and certainly for Novavax, that would be true. The DNA vaccines coming out from Oxford, AstraZeneca, and from Johnson & Johnson do involve a viral delivery system. And so those might be a different, sort of answer for those who are on immune suppressive drugs.
Great. Okay, so we're right at, I can't thank you enough for all of this. I know all of us are very appreciative. It's at 5 o'clock. Normally we close out at this point, but if people want to hang on for maybe another 5 to 10 minutes, if you're agreeable to that, we can. And if I open it up to any other questions that haven't been answered yet. So I see that Alan Cohen has his hand raised. Can you unmute yourself, Alan, and then we'll take your question.
There you go. Okay. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have the following questions. I'm concerned about the logistics of getting a shot, and that's why I'm asking this question. Assuming that you get the Pfizer shot first, you have to stick with Pfizer for the second one, or can you get to the Moderna shot on the second one, or vice versa?
That's a good question, and I've seen virologist friends bat this idea around on Twitter. We would say that, you probably should get the second dose with the same brand as the first dose. I think all medical experts would agree to that. Why is that? Because we have confidence that we can tell you what the likelihood is of it benefiting you if you do it that way. We don't have any research that speaks to doing dosing with one and then doing dosing with the other. And so we can't really predict how well it would work. On paper, it probably would, produce the same effect, even if you were using the other product. And it certainly wouldn't do anything bad to you that we would expect. But officially, we don't have a lot of information. We can't say with confidence that it's going to do its job, because we never did a study where we gave Pfizer first and then Moderna second, or vice versa. So we can't fully predict it. Whereas we did do studies with 2 doses of one or 2 doses of the other, and we can describe what we expect to have happen from that. And so but I don't think it would hurt you if that through I'm sure with pretty much everyone in the country eventually getting vaccinated, hopefully, except for people who refuse to get vaccinated, which is an unfortunate other topic. I'm sure there will be people who will wind up by accident getting one and then the other. It probably won't hurt them. It probably will boost their immunity the way it's supposed to make it longer lasting, but we can't really say for sure what will happen because we haven't done it. So, it'll be interesting to follow people who have that happen to see if, in fact, they develop the immunity we predict them to. We can do blood work on them and figure that out. But I think on the face of it, it won't hurt anything, but we wouldn't recommend it doing that way because they're not designed to be used that way. And we just don't have information on how well it'll work.
Okay, one last question from John. You've asked quite a few questions, but I hope this is a different one than all the other wonderful ones. Go ahead.
We know from the 2 mRNA vaccines how effective they are in preventing disease with significant symptoms. What about the prevention of transmission?
Yeah.
What's the state of knowledge right now with these 2 vaccines that we have available in this country?
That's a fantastic question to ask. $64,000 question. So the expectation is that although these vaccines were not designed to prevent you getting infected, and we didn't design them to prevent transmission, these vaccines were designed to prevent hospitalization when you get COVID, and they're very good at doing that job. Pfizer did not look at the shedding of virus in people who were vaccinated who had the poor luck to get COVID after they were vaccinated, but Moderna did. And in the Moderna patients, even after a single dose, they showed less shedding of virus. So the expectation is that although they weren't designed to reduce transmission, we expect that they will, and that anybody who contracts COVID who's been properly vaccinated will have a harder time spreading it to other people. regardless of whether those other people themselves got vaccinated, which is the ideal case, which then drastically reduces transmission. But yes, it does look like from Moderna's data that there is reduction of transmission, from folks who have been vaccinated, even after a single dose, if they happen to contract COVID. So we're optimistic. And, that's true for a lot of viruses, even though we don't necessarily design them to prevent transmission, many of them do anyway. So, because they work to prevent, virus activity, and virus activity is how you wind up making contagious virus. So I think most people expected that, vaccines that would reduce disease would also reduce transmission, but we just have a little bit of data from Moderna on that. Some of the other vaccines that are in development are also looking at shedding. The only way you can do that is have everybody take like a weekly PCR test and look for virus. And that way, who gets COVID by a test result, as opposed to by symptoms. And you can also see how much virus they're producing if they do get COVID. So you can make a judgment about how much vaccination impacted it. So we should have data on other products. And we may even have belated data on Pfizer, but Moderna did show less virus being shed in folks who contracted COVID who were vaccinated.
Fantastic. I'm sure all of us, Juan has his hand up, so I'm gonna let Juan go ahead.
So I took a shingles vaccine in November, and I'm supposed to take the next vaccine, the second shot, in January or February. And I was told that if I was going to take the COVID-19 vaccine, not to take them too close to each other. So what is the recommendation? How many days?
Yeah. So that's another really excellent question. So traditionally with vaccines, we generally consider most vaccines to be able to even be given at the same time. So if you've ever been, to the doctor to get your pneumonia vaccination, you can get your flu shot at the same time, and we give them together. And we don't think that's a problem. So why is there a special advisory about not being vaccinated with something else 2 weeks before or after your COVID vaccine? Answer: because we don't really know how that might affect your ability to respond to the COVID vaccine. And nobody wants to do anything that would mess up your immunity from the COVID vaccination. So we're playing it super careful. Is it against the law, or will you blow up if you get both vaccinations within 2 weeks of each other? No. In fact, it may have no impact on the success of your COVID vaccination at all. But there is this official advice not to get a vaccine 2 weeks before or 2 weeks after your COVID vaccination, just because we can't really predict how that's going to affect your response. It's sort of like me telling you that if you get side effects from being vaccinated, use Tylenol, don't use ibuprofen or other anti-inflammatories, because there's this theoretical concern that it might mess up your response to the COVID vaccine. We don't know that another vaccine, in the previous 2 weeks is going to mess up your response to the COVID vaccine, but we don't know. So we're playing it cautious and saying, just don't mix the vaccines until we have more information. But, most vaccines, when we look at them and we study the question, we find out that they don't interfere with each other for the most part. In most cases, there's some exceptions to that, but generally speaking, most vaccines we think of as being able to be given together without a big deal. I mean, we don't give you usually more than 2 at a time, because that can be a whole heck of a lot of stuff to throw at your immune system at once if you do too many of them. But that's why there's that advice. And so it's like not against the law. Your head won't explode if you get them too close to each other, but it's just sort of a precaution, because we don't really know how being recently vaccinated with something else might affect your immune system's ability to respond to the COVID vaccine. And nobody wants to mess up your COVID vaccine response. So that's why we give that advice. So, I would just say, since there's some uncertainty, you said what, February is when you're getting your dose?
Yeah. Oh, you have to unmute
Juan,
yourself.
you have to unmute.
Yeah, probably in February, my second shot of the shingles. But because of the scheduling being so difficult, then I'm thinking I'd rather wait. Don't take that one if I can come get the COVID vaccine in the next month.
I would say that's reasonable, because as soon as you get your COVID vaccine, you can get your shingles second dose 2 weeks after that, no problem.
Yeah.
So, and you're right, that's right around the time that you'd likely get a yes on your COVID vaccine. So you can push the date of your second dose probably a little bit. Obviously, talk to your doctor about it, but I don't think you'll be harmed as far as your shingles immunity. And you're right, once you get your COVID shot, you can immediately proceed, 2 weeks later with getting your shingles vaccine, and then you won't have, mixed them together, and kept it sort of precautious. So I think that's the way to do it. And yeah, talk to your doctor about it, but I don't see a downside to pushing the date of the second dose until you've gotten that COVID vaccine under your belt, and then wait 2 weeks, and then anytime that's convenient, go get your second shingles dose.
Okay, so one last question, and then we really have to wrap it up. Tom, I know Tom Moore, you had your hand up.
Oh, yeah, actually, my husband and I are getting our Modero shots tomorrow. This is through Kaiser.
Yep.
And we'll be at the Van Buren Medical Center at Riverside Kaiser, a couple blocks away. But I'm scheduled for a polio shot too, about the same time. I've already done my labs for that, but they wanted me to wait about 3 weeks after I get the shot tomorrow, but before the second shot.
Well, that's a long
Okay.
Just to kind of share it with one, same kind of idea, conflicting.
Yeah, well, and that's, because the Prolia is an antibody, it's, so I think that's why they just don't want to mix up the treatment. So
Right.
again, it's not that we know there's a problem. It's more that we're not really sure how they'll interact. And so just as a precaution, we're trying not to do too many immunomodulating things at the same time. We want to kind of keep the stage cleared, so to speak, for the COVID vaccine to be able to concentrate on producing immunity in you. And then, your other treatments can come forward later. So, yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yeah.
I know, Richard, you'd like to say a word.
Yeah, Dr. Loftus, your work and your just being available to share your time and
Yeah.
knowledge with us. You are an angel, and I hope you realize that. So thank you so much on behalf.
Well, John Ninos has worked with me, so he knows I'm not an angel, and you can ask him stories about me later. but
Well, that
but,
would be
thank you.
for
It's
another.
absolutely. It's my pleasure. I was really glad to be asked. I really feel that medical scientists don't get a chance often enough to talk to the public. And it's so important for us to do that, because a lot of, I think, how this country has struggled has been because our citizenry don't have enough familiarity with science, and that hasn't been to our advantage as a country. So I really think any opportunity that science communicators, like me, I mean, I'm fortunate in that I had a background in journalism before I went into medical science. And so I have some training in communication. So that helps when I have to talk to folks who don't have a science background to explain scientific stuff in plain language that people can absorb and understand and answer questions. Because the citizenry that's informed about the science makes good decisions that protect themselves and the people they love. And so that's what I think we should aspire to. And I've had many good mentors. I mean, I have so many colleagues. Saskia Popescu, who works in Tucson, is just an amazing, she's my inspiration for how to talk about vaccines. And there's a few other doctors, that have been on, I mean, there's about probably a dozen of them who've been on TV every night, one of them for the last 6 months. And I really take my cue from them. But, it's what I think we should all be doing to help our community get educated and get this virus contained so we can go back to a normal life.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you so much. Yes. Everybody,
Thank you,
give an
Doctor.
applause. Yay.
Well, thank you for getting together and having this conversation. I think it's so important to educate people. I'm always happy to talk to any groups that want to educate the public. So thanks for hosting this and letting me participate. And if you guys want me back ever, Richard knows how to reach me. So just ping me and I'll be happy to come back. Hopefully we won't have any more crazy stuff to have to learn about. I've learned enough about this virus to last a lifetime. I have a feeling I'll be working on long COVID for the rest of my academic career. But I hope we make some progress in preventing it from happening for a lot of people is my hope. So go vaccines, go science. Science is real. And
Well,
thanks
maybe,
again for having me on.
Our
Maybe
pleasure.
sometime in the future, you can join us for a fun conversation, just for the heck
Yes.
of it.
Yes, we can talk about the good old days of the pandemic and how we got through it.
Yeah, that will be, we're all looking forward to that. So as we wrap up, everybody, thank you for being part of this wonderful special PALS Cafe presentation today. I want to remind you, if you haven't already signed up already, we have a seminar on Saturday that is entitled Own Your Future, the 7 Essential Conversations You Must Have Now. Some of you may have already attended a PALS seminar like this in the past. We're doing this for the first time in a Zoom format, and it's going to be really fun and informative and a lot of new information that you may not have heard the last time we did it, which was probably a little over maybe a year and a half ago. So we hope to see you there, and please sign up if you haven't already. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
You.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks. Good to see everybody.
Stay
Be
safe in the
everybody.
interim.
Get those vaccines. Be
Yes.
patient and persistent.
Keep your soul smiling. We'll miss you till next week.
Yes.
Soul smiling, absolutely.
Soul smiling.
Yes.
Bye, Hector. Cindy,
Bye, Cindy. Bye, everybody. Bye, Michael.
Barbara.
Bye. I
Wait,
might have to dress up next week, Barbara. I'm impressed. I'm sorry.
Oh, she left.
Whoa. She left mid-sentence.
We already pushed the button.
That was good. Wow, he's amazing.
Wow, right? Wow.
Wow.
Good job, Richard. That was fascinating.
He's really, really good. He knows how to talk, though.
Yes,
I
you did
know.
a great job, Lorraine, and keep it that.